The courtroom was silent, save for the occasional rustling in the papers and the faint hum of the air conditioning. Judge William Carter sat at the bench, his expression as cold and immovable as the marble walls surrounding him. A seasoned jurist, known for his strict adherence to the law and his unyielding demeanor, Judge Carter believed in justice above all else, or at least his interpretation of it. Today he faced a case that had already captured public attention, though he had done his best to remain detached from the media frenzy. The defendant was a woman named Amara James. She stood at the defense table, her posture composed, her hands clasped in front of her. Despite the seriousness of the charges against her, there was no trace of fear or submission in her demeanor. Amara was accused of trespassing on private property during a protest. According to the prosecution, she had deliberately disrupted operations at a corporate site to make a political statement. The charges seemed straightforward enough, and Judge Carter had dealt with similar cases before. In his mind, the law was clear. No matter how noble the cause, the law could not be broken without consequences. Yet something about this woman unsettled him. She wasn't the first activist to stand before him, but her calm, unyielding gaze seemed to pierce through his carefully constructed walls of impartiality. Her presence commanded attention, and even in the courtroom, there was a quiet reverence among those who had come to watch the proceedings. As the prosecutor laid out the charges, Judge Carter kept his eyes on Amara. She didn't flinch or react. Her silence was powerful, almost louder than the words being spoken against her. Then came the turn for the defense, and Amara chose to speak for herself. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and resonant, "I stand here today not to deny my actions, but to explain them. What I did was not out of defiance for the law, but out of a deep respect for the principles that law is meant to uphold: justice, equality, and the protection of human dignity. If standing up for those principles makes me guilty, then so be it." Her words, though measured, carried an emotional weight that rippled through the courtroom. For a moment, Judge Carter felt a pang of discomfort. He quickly dismissed it, reminding himself that this was just another case, another defendant trying to justify their actions. But when Amara continued, her words began to cut deeper. "I have spent my life fighting for those who cannot fight for themselves. My actions on that day were not for personal gain, but to shine a light on the exploitation and suffering that many choose to ignore. If the law requires me to stand down in the face of such injustice, then perhaps it is not the law that I am defying, but the misuse of it." The room was so quiet you could hear the scribbling of a reporter's pen in the back row. Judge Carter leaned back in his chair, his stern expression unchanged, though his mind was not as composed as it appeared. He wanted to dismiss her words as idealistic rhetoric, but there was something in her voice, a quiet certainty that challenged everything he thought he knew about justice. As the day wore on, witnesses were called, evidence was presented, and the arguments unfolded. Yet Judge Carter found himself distracted, unable to shake the nagging question that had taken root in his mind. Who was Amara James really? During a brief recess, he glanced over some background documents on the case. What he found was unexpected. Amara wasn't just an activist. She was a renowned scholar, an accomplished lawyer, and a widely respected advocate for human rights. Her work had taken her to war zones, impoverished communities, and international summits. She had stood face to face with world leaders, demanding change and accountability. Judge Carter frowned as he read through her accolades. If all this were true, then why had she taken such a risk, breaking the law in a way that seemed almost reckless? He couldn't reconcile the image of a calculated, global leader with the woman who now faced him in his courtroom. By the time court reconvened, Judge Carter's curiosity had turned into something deeper, a sense of unease. As the defense presented its final arguments, Amara's words struck a chord that he couldn't ignore. She spoke of children without homes, families torn apart by greed, and lives lost because justice had been twisted into a tool for oppression. The final blow came when a young woman took the stand as a character witness for Amara. She was nervous, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Amara saved my life," she said simply. "When no one else cared, she fought for me. If she hadn't, I wouldn't be here today." The words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Judge Carter looked at Amara again, and for the first time, he saw her not as a defendant, but as a human being. A woman who had dedicated her life to a cause far greater than herself. But the law was the law, and as the judge prepared to deliver his ruling, his mind wavered, caught in a battle between duty and doubt. What would he decide? Judge Carter sat back in his chair, hands steepled as he stared down at the courtroom. The weight of the decision ahead loomed over him like a dark cloud. Amara James was unlike any defendant he had ever encountered, and the evidence presented had left him unsettled in ways he couldn't yet articulate. The testimonies, the stories of lives she had touched, the undeniable impact of her work, they all painted a picture of someone far removed from the label of criminal. Yet the law demanded clarity, not sentiment. As the courtroom fell silent, the prosecution began their closing arguments. The lead prosecutor, a sharp-tongued man named Daniel Ellis, took his place before the jury. His voice was crisp and authoritative, a tone that often swayed juries to his favor. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this case is not about Ms. James' achievements or her good intentions. It is about the law. No matter how noble her cause may seem, she trespassed on private property and disrupted lawful operations. If we allow exceptions for actions like these, we erode the very foundation of justice itself." Ellis' words echoed through the courtroom, his argument punctuated by sharp glances at the jury. Judge Carter kept his expression neutral, though inwardly he wrestled with his own thoughts. There was a certain logic to Ellis' argument. Laws had to be upheld, didn't they? But as he glanced at Amara, sitting quietly at the defense table, he couldn't help but feel that something vital was being overlooked. Amara's attorney, a younger woman named Rachel Morgan, rose for her closing argument. She was calm, almost disarmingly so, and her tone was conversational as she addressed the jury. "My esteemed colleague is correct in one regard. This case is about the law. But the law is not just a set of rules written on paper. It is meant to serve the people, to protect them, and to uphold justice. What Ms. James did may technically fall outside the bounds of the law, but ask yourselves, did her actions cause harm, or did they seek to prevent it? Did she trespass for personal gain, or did she do it to bring attention to a greater injustice?" Rachel paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "We are not asking you to dismiss the law. We are asking you to consider its purpose. Because if the law punishes those who fight for the voiceless, then perhaps it is not justice we are serving, but power." The courtroom was utterly still. Even Ellis seemed momentarily taken aback by the quiet power of Rachel's words. Judge Carter watched the jury closely, noting the conflicted expressions on their faces. He had seen many cases where the outcome was clear from the start, but this one was different. The lines between right and wrong, legal and moral, were blurring before his eyes. As the jury was dismissed to deliberate, Judge Carter retreated to his chambers. He needed a moment to think, to sift through the emotions and arguments that had been presented. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the familiar ritual grounding him as he sat at his desk. His eyes drifted to the file on Amara James, still open on his desk. Curiosity gnawed at him. He had heard of Amara's work in passing, but he had never taken the time to understand its full scope. Now, with the trial forcing her story into the spotlight, he found himself drawn to her history. She had grown up in a small town in the Deep South, facing discrimination and hardship from a young age. Her father had been a factory worker, her mother a nurse, both of them instilling in her a deep sense of resilience and fairness. By the time she was 20, Amara had already begun organizing community programs, helping displaced families, and challenging systemic inequalities. Her efforts caught the attention of international organizations, and she quickly rose to prominence as a human rights advocate. She had worked in some of the most dangerous regions in the world, negotiating ceasefires, providing aid, and holding powerful entities accountable for their actions. And yet, despite her global acclaim, she had remained deeply connected to her roots. The protest that had led to her arrest was a prime example of this. She had joined local activists to oppose a corporation accused of exploiting vulnerable workers and polluting the environment. The corporation had tried to silence the protests through legal threats, but Amara had refused to back down. Judge Carter leaned back in his chair, the weight of her story pressing down on him. He couldn't deny the impact she had made, nor could he ignore the fact that her actions, while technically illegal, had been driven by a moral compass that many would admire. But admiration wasn't enough to absolve her in the eyes of the law. The knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. It was his clerk, informing him that the jury had reached a verdict. Judge Carter felt a tightness in his chest as he made his way back to the courtroom. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation as the jury filed in, their faces giving nothing away. As the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict, Judge Carter's gaze flickered to Amara. She was calm, unshaken, her expression unreadable. Whatever the verdict, it was clear that she had already made peace with it. But for Judge Carter, the moment felt fraught with tension. He knew this case would leave a lasting impact, not just on Amara, but on himself and everyone in the courtroom. "Have you reached a verdict?" he asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, holding the slip of paper that would determine Amara's fate. As the verdict was handed to the bailiff and brought to Judge Carter, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. He unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the words written there. But before he could announce it, a memory surfaced in his mind, something Amara had said during the trial. "I have spent my life fighting for those who cannot fight for themselves," she had said. "If standing up for them makes him guilty, then I accept that. But I will not apologize for doing what is right." Those words echoed in his mind, challenging him to reconsider not just the verdict, but the very principles he had built his career on. Judge Carter took a deep breath, the verdict still in his hands. As the weight of the moment pressed down on him, he glanced once more at Amara, her calm and unwavering presence, a stark contrast to the tension filling the room. The decision he was about to announce would be remembered, not just as a ruling, but as a reflection of the values he chose to uphold. And yet, a part of him wondered, was this truly justice, or was it simply the law? Judge Carter held the verdict in his hands, the courtroom's silence weighing on him like a heavy fog. He had read countless verdicts over the years, some that carried more gravity than others, but this one felt personal. For reasons he couldn't fully articulate, this case had breached the walls of his professional detachment. He wasn't just a judge in that moment. He was a man grappling with the consequences of the law he was sworn to uphold. He cleared his throat, his voice steady as he addressed the jury. "Before we proceed with the verdict, I need a moment to review something in chambers." His words were met with murmurs of surprise, the jury and courtroom spectators exchanging puzzled glances. This was highly irregular and he knew it. But Carter wasn't ready to finalize the case yet. He needed to think, to weigh every piece of information one more time. Back in his chambers, Carter stared at the file on Amara James. He flipped through pages of legal documents, witness testimonies, and photographs. His eyes landed on one particular image. Amara standing outside the gates of the factory, holding a sign that read, "Human rights are non-negotiable." Behind her, workers of all ages, many of them elderly or visibly unwell, had gathered. The pain on their faces told a story that numbers and charts couldn't capture. As he sat there, he was interrupted by his clerk, a young man named Ben who had only recently joined the courthouse staff. "Judge Carter," Ben said hesitantly, "if you don't mind me saying, I've been following this case closely, and I think there's more to the story than what's been said in court." Carter looked up, his brow furrowed. "What are you getting at, Ben?" Ben shifted nervously. "I did some digging, off the record. There's a group of people outside the courthouse. They're not protesters. They're people she's helped over the years. Families from all over the world. They've been trying to get in touch with you. I thought you should know." Carter's initial instinct was to dismiss the comment. He wasn't supposed to let outside influences affect his rulings. But something about Ben's tone made him pause. "How many people are we talking about?" "A lot," Ben replied, "and they're not just here for show. I overheard some of them talking. One man said she saved his village from being wiped out by warlords. Another woman said Amara helped her escape an abusive situation. There's even a doctor from Europe who claims Amara's work brought medical supplies to remote areas where people were dying of preventable diseases." Carter leaned back in his chair, his thoughts churning. These were stories that hadn't been presented in court. They weren't relevant to the charges, but they painted a fuller picture of who Amara James really was. He felt a pang of guilt for not delving deeper earlier. He had been so focused on the legality of her actions that he had failed to consider the broader context. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, Amara sat quietly, her demeanor calm despite the delay. Rachel leaned over and whispered, "This is unusual. I've never seen him step out like that before a verdict." Amara smiled faintly. Unusual isn't always bad. Sometimes it means someone is thinking instead of just reacting. Outside the courthouse, a growing crowd had gathered. Among them was a young woman named Sophia, who clutched a small, worn notebook in her hands. She had traveled from another state to be there, determined to make her voice heard. Sophia had first met Amara 3 years earlier at a community center where Amara had been speaking about human rights. At the time, Sophia had been homeless, struggling to find her footing after aging out of the foster care system. Amara had noticed her in the crowd and taken the time to speak with her one-on-one. That conversation had changed Sophia's life. "She told me I was worth fighting for," Sophia said to a reporter who was covering the trial. "No one had ever said that to me before. Because of her, I went back to school and got my degree. I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for Amara James." Stories like Sophia's were being shared among the crowd, their collective energy growing as they waited for news from inside. Some held signs that read, "Justice for Amara," and "Human rights are not a crime." Others simply stood silently, their presence a testament to the impact one person could have. Back in his chambers, Judge Carter felt a sense of urgency pressing down on him. He knew he couldn't keep the courtroom waiting forever, but he also knew he couldn't rush this decision. He picked up the phone and called his clerk. "Ben, can you arrange for me to meet with a few of the people outside? Just a brief, informal conversation. I need to hear their stories." Ben hesitated. "That's highly unusual, sir." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Carter replied firmly. "This case isn't just about what's in the file. It's about what's at stake for the people involved." Within minutes, a small group of individuals was brought into a private conference room. Judge Carter listened intently as they shared their experiences with Amara. Each story added a new layer to his understanding of her character and motivations. By the time they finished, he felt a profound sense of admiration for the woman on trial in his courtroom. When Carter returned to the bench, his expression was unreadable. The jury, the attorneys, and the spectators all watched him closely, their anticipation palpable. "I've had the opportunity to reflect further on this case," he began, his voice measured, "and I want to thank everyone for their patience. The jury's verdict will be read momentarily, but I want to acknowledge something first. This case raises questions that go beyond the confines of this courtroom. Questions about the intersection of law and morality, and the role of individuals who challenge the status quo." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "We are tasked with upholding the law, but we must also remember that the law is a living framework, one that evolves to meet the needs of society. As we consider this verdict, I urge all of us to think about what kind of justice we are serving." The tension in the room was electric. Amara met Judge Carter's gaze, her eyes steady and unflinching. Whatever the outcome, it was clear that she would continue to stand by her principles. But for Carter, the decision he was about to make felt like a crossroads, a moment that would define not just this case, but his own legacy. The foreperson stood once more, holding the slip of paper that contained the jury's verdict. As it was handed to the judge, Carter felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. Whatever happened next, he knew the impact of this case would ripple far beyond the walls of the courthouse. The courtroom seemed to grow even quieter as Judge Carter held the paper in his hands. His fingers trembled slightly, a subtle motion that no one else could see, but to him, it felt as though the entire weight of the world rested on those few words. The tension in the air was thick, charged with an anticipation that pulsed like electricity. Every eye in the room was locked on him, waiting for his decision. Amara sat perfectly still, her hands resting gently in her lap. She had been through enough of these kinds of battles to know how this moment worked. It didn't matter how right you were or how loud the voices of those supporting you were. In the end, it was the system's decision that would carry the most weight. And yet she had a quiet, unshakable confidence. It was the confidence of someone who knew the truth couldn't be erased, no matter how many verdicts were handed down. The gallery held its breath as Carter's voice broke the silence. "I had a chance to listen, reflect, and consider the broader implications of this case. The jury has reached a verdict, and we will proceed." His eyes scanned the room, meeting Amara's once more. Her gaze was unwavering, not defiant, but steady, almost as if she knew this moment was inevitable. The foreperson of the jury stood once more, clearing their throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Amara James, guilty of the charges brought against her." The words landed like a heavy stone, and for a brief moment, there was a collective gasp in the room. The air felt suddenly thick, suffocating. Judge Carter's hand tightened around the paper, and he slowly looked back at Amara. Her face betrayed nothing. No shock, no anger, just a quiet acceptance, as though the weight of the system's decision didn't even faze her. But beneath the calm exterior, Carter could see something flicker in her eyes. Was it resignation? Or was it the calm before a storm? Amara had never been the type to back down. She wasn't just some activist fighting for change, she was a force. And yet, here she was, facing charges that could alter the course of her life, and the lives of countless others who had looked to her for guidance. As the room erupted into murmurs, the tension was almost unbearable. The weight of the jury's decision wasn't just on Amara, it was on everyone. In the courtroom, outside on the steps, in the streets where Amara's supporters had gathered, her name had become a symbol. It was no longer just about her actions. It was about the ideals she stood for, the change she was fighting for, and the message this verdict would send to the world. Outside, the crowd had grown larger. The voices of her supporters, once confined to quiet whispers and online petitions, had turned into a roar. They had come to the courthouse, not just to support Amara, but to stand for something larger. Human rights, justice, the right to fight against oppressive systems. They had come in droves from across the country and beyond because they believed in what she had done. They believed in her. And yet, as much as they believed in her, there was an undeniable sense of fear in the air. Fear that the system they had always been taught to trust was failing them. Fear that if Amara could be condemned, then what would that mean for all the other activists who were out there fighting for justice? What would it mean for the ordinary people who dared to stand up and speak out? In the courtroom, Amara remained silent, the words of the verdict hanging in the air. The moment felt suspended in time. The murmurs of the crowd outside were drowned out by the rush of blood in Carter's ears. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, threatening to crush him. What was the right choice here? What was the just choice? And then, just as the weight of the moment seemed unbearable, a voice echoed in his mind, one that he couldn't ignore. He had remembered the stories, the ones he'd heard in his chambers from people whose lives had been changed by Amara's actions. He thought of Sophia, of the young woman whose life had been transformed because someone had taken the time to listen to her. He thought of the old man, the crowd outside, whose village had been saved from violent destruction because Amara had brokered peace with the warlords. He thought of the refugees in Europe, the ones whose families had found safety, whose children had been given a future, all because Amara had used her voice to rally the world to their cause. The tension in the room grew palpable as Carter's mind swirled with these thoughts. Was this verdict truly just, or was it another example of a system that didn't understand the people it was meant to serve? The jury, who had delivered their verdict so swiftly, looked uncomfortable now. The foreperson shifted on their feet, eyes darting between Carter and the defendant. The room's atmosphere had changed, a shift that no one had anticipated. Outside, the protesters were growing louder. Some had begun chanting her name. They were angry, passionate, determined. They believed in Amara, but more importantly, they believed in the change she represented, the change they needed. The tension outside mirrored the one building inside the courthouse, a tension that was quickly turning into something much bigger than anyone had anticipated. Amara sat, her hands now clenched at her sides. Her jaw was tight, and her eyes locked on the judge. Carter could see something in her expression now, a quiet determination. It wasn't resignation. It was strength. She wasn't going to back down. He could feel the eyes of the world on him now. The eyes of the people who had come to support her, the eyes of the people who had fought for her, the eyes of the ones who didn't even know her but felt she was a symbol of everything they had ever hoped for. And then, the final twist. A man tall and imposing entered the courtroom. He had a presence that couldn't be ignored. He was dressed in a suit, but it wasn't the suit of a lawyer or a politician or anyone who would typically enter such a space. This man was different. His eyes were focused, determined, and when he opened his mouth to speak, his voice resonated with authority. "I need to speak, Your Honor," the man said, his gaze locking with Judge Carter's. "This case is not over." The room fell deathly silent as the man spoke. His words hung in the air like a challenge, one that no one had expected, not even Amara. Her eyes narrowed slightly, studying him as he took a step forward. She could sense the tension in the room shifting, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Judge Carter's expression flickered between confusion and suspicion. He hadn't anticipated this. He hadn't anticipated anyone disrupting the proceedings at this point. But the man didn't wait for an invitation. He moved forward, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the courtroom. "I'm not here to represent the defense," the man said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "I'm here because there's something you need to know, something that changes everything." The murmur of the crowd outside began to filter in through the closed doors, but inside, all eyes were fixed on the stranger. Judge Carter stood, unsure of what to do next. He was a man of order, a man who had followed the law to the letter for decades, but this felt different. This felt personal. Amara's heartbeat quickened. Something in her gut told her this man was not just anyone. She could feel the shift, the change in energy around her, the subtle hum of a revelation that was about to break through. The man locked eyes with her for a brief moment, and Amara could see the weight of the knowledge in his gaze. There was something he knew, something critical, and for the first time in a long while, she felt herself wondering if this battle was going to take a turn she hadn't anticipated. "I know what this is about," the man continued, his eyes sweeping across the courtroom. "But I also know what's at stake here, and I can't let this happen. Amara James isn't the woman you think she is. She's not just an activist. She's the key to something much larger, something that could change the way this country and perhaps the world functions, and you all need to understand that. The courtroom went even quieter. People exchanged confused glances. The judge's brow furrowed as he turned to the man. "What exactly are you implying?" The stranger's gaze never wavered. "What I'm saying is that this trial, this entire case, is part of a much bigger plan. A plan that's been in motion for years." Judge Carter's confusion deepened, and even Amara felt a tight knot of unease forming in her chest. Was this man trying to tell them that this case wasn't just about her? That it was part of something much more complex? He stepped closer to the judge's bench, his voice growing more intense. "The people who are pulling the strings behind this trial, they don't want you to know the truth. They don't want anyone to know who Amara James really is or what she's capable of. They've been watching her for years, and now that she's on the verge of something monumental, they're doing everything they can to destroy her." Amara's mind raced, her thoughts swirling like a storm. Who was this man? And how did he know so much about her life? Her first instinct was to reject him. He was just another player in a game she had no control over, another person trying to control her narrative. But as the man spoke, she felt a part of her that had been buried for so long start to wake up. The truth, whatever it was out there, and she needed to know it. "Who are you?" she finally asked, her voice low, but filled with a quiet intensity that caught everyone's attention. The man turned to her, his expression softening for the first time since he entered the room. "I've been following your work for years, Amara," he said, his tone genuine but heavy with the weight of something unspoken. "I'm not just some random person trying to cause chaos. I'm someone who's been watching from the sidelines, and I know the dangers you're about to face. You think this trial is the worst of it? It's just the beginning." Amara felt a chill run down her spine. She had known the stakes were high, but this was different. The man wasn't just here to defend her, he was here to warn her about something bigger than she could have ever imagined. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" Amara demanded, her frustration building. "Why now?" The man shook his head. "Because I couldn't risk it. The people who are behind this trial, behind your persecution, they've had eyes on you for longer than you know. If I had spoken up earlier, you would have been targeted sooner. But now it's the only chance we have to expose the truth." The room was thick with confusion. The jury exchanged glances, their faces filled with doubt. Carter, visibly shaken, tried to regain control of the situation. "This is highly irregular," he said, his voice strained. "We cannot continue this trial without understanding the full extent of these claims. Someone needs to explain." "I'll explain," the man cut in, his voice calm but insistent. "But not here. Not in this court. Not in front of the people who are too blinded by the lies they've been fed to see what's really going on. If you want to know the truth, you'll have to come with me." Judge Carter's face twisted in disbelief. "Come with you? What kind of nonsense is this?" But Amara's curiosity was piqued. She stood slowly, her eyes never leaving the stranger. There was something in his demeanor that spoke to her, a quiet certainty that drew her in. For the first time in years, she felt as though there was someone who truly understood the magnitude of what was at stake. "Take me there," she said, her voice steady but full of conviction. "Take me to where you've been hiding the truth." The room erupted in chaos as the man nodded, stepping back to allow her passage. For a moment, it seemed like the world outside the courtroom had descended into madness, and Amara was about to step into something far larger than any trial could contain. The air was thick with anticipation as Amara turned to leave, the eyes of every person in that room fixed on her. There were whispers, uncertain gazes, and questions left unanswered. But one thing was clear, the story of Amara James had just entered its most dangerous chapter yet, and nothing would ever be the same again.